got a sort of film script bubbling away on that. But he was a member of the Medicis who were Neoplatonists. They were learned people. He wanted this wonderful new continent to be a haven for freedom of thought and free adventures of the mind. And things like the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, founded by a Canadian. These were America should get back on track with its real script, which goes back to Florence and the original Renaissance thinkers like Francis Bacon. They betrayed that heritage, these guys.
You talked about science. You need science to get further on. That's again going the other way over in the US of A.
They're shutting down science, aren't
Yeah.
they? I mean, they're trying. This Trump guy's trying to control what science is and define it.
He doesn't know. He doesn't want people smarter than himself to have anything to say, and so he has got quite a battle to fight. I think most people are more intelligent than he is.
Well, yes, obviously. I mean,
when you see him and hear him,
you
just sees it.
He's challenged in various ways, to put it politely, and I don't think he can. I think it's just a question of limiting the amount of damage that him and his faction do before they're eventually voted out. I believe the midterms will see the demise of
I hope so.
Their message, and American democracy will get back on track. I look forward to the Illinois governor, Pritzker, who's a genuine American intellectual of substance and a senior politician for the Democrat Party, who's absolutely seen through the Trump lies, like Bernie Sanders and others.
Bernie Sanders got quite a schedule.
He's amazing. He's energized, and as everyone should be. I mean, I read some reports today, which I believe, that some research has shown that Kamala Harris actually won the election just held, because what happened was, in the run-up to it, so many voters were excluded as by deliberate targeting by extreme right agitational groups who were stopping black voters, women voters, the poor and so on, and making it increasingly difficult to vote. And they've calculated up, like, millions of people were excluded from the register. If they had voted, Kamala Harris would have won hands down. The only reason they won is because of all this fiddling going on behind the scenes. And interestingly enough, I can report a story similar in Britain. I was talking on the phones to various voters. I spoke to a strong Liberal Democrat voter woman who said she had been to vote. She was voting Liberal Democrat, and she was prevented from voting because she didn't have exactly the right ID. She had her voting card, but she didn't have like a driver's license or a passport with a photograph, and that was enough to exclude her vote. So it's happening in Britain too. I don't agree with that. I think she's an old elderly lady, she doesn't drive, she doesn't need a driving license, etc. She should be allowed to vote. It's her right, And probably if that's happening by the thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands across the Britain, that explains why the voice of moderation has been hijacked. Yes. Well, no, thanks for those comments. Yeah, I mean, America. Well, that's what they call it. But I think we're going to have to think of a new name for it now, because it's become a crazy place.
America is big, yet there's tiny little mass of small states in between called the United States of America. They're not very united any longer.
No, I think they're kind of... Anyway, I still believe in that American dream.
Well, most people I know, most American I know are very good people. But
yeah. Let's just pray. Okay, let's move on and look at our periodic table, as is our wont. And
I was wavering between 165 and 166. philosophy, political theory, and practice.
Legal theory, yeah. Well, which one calls your most?
I mean, they're both broken.
They're both important.
Both important these
Yeah.
days, and I think maybe we should.
Do 165, maybe.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about that, haven't we?
Yeah. Have we?
Well, I mean,
Well,
I was,
yeah,
I was
Yeah.
talking about it in my little words.
Yeah.
So, what are you going to do that one, 165?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. And since we're talking about America, I'm going to do American Indians, number 8, which is the primal religion. And I've got some things I can share about that. So I'll do that one first because that's chronologically probably the earliest.
Yeah.
When I lived in Canada, well, I was born there, so my first glimpse of sunshine and breathing and all that is on American soil. I loved North America. I was born in the 50s. My father helped run the Canadian National Railways, which kept the country together. He had a free pass travelling all over Canada. It was just a beautiful dream, this thing called Canada. And we were happy being not part of the USA, but we also liked having them there as neighbours. It was before television really, and so it was all friends. And my father had a brother who lived in Philadelphia, so we used to go for holidays down there. It was the size of the place that I think was so impressive to a little boy growing up. And of course I loved all the history, and Davy Crockett was my hero, the great frontier guy, but also the Indians fascinated me. And I remember I had a little buckskin jacket as a little boy, to play around in the neighbourhood, and I would dress up and be an Indian. I just felt a resonance there. Years later, I went back in my early 20s, when I was 21 to 25, and I lived in Alberta, and I studied and studied and studied. It was where I did my most serious academic research, actually, at the University of Calgary.
That's in BC, isn't it?
No, it's in Alberta.
Alberta,
Yeah, it's the one before BC. But I flew to Vancouver to get there, and then got a bus up to Calgary and Edmonton, where I lived. I helped manage a bookshop, and then I worked in veterans' hospitals, and we had some Canadian Indian soldiers that were in the hospitals who tended to be Roman Catholics because they were French Canadians, and they were very amazing people. I learned an awful lot from them about the kind of values that they stood for. And I'd go around at night, and often in the dark I could see one of them would be doing his rosary, doing his prayers with his rosary. And they were very profound people, and they'd given their all for Canada. And then in this veterans hospital, they were there essentially till they died. It was like a free hospital, free hotel for them. And my job was to then, when they died, was to clean, wash the body, and then you had to then put it in a body bag and take it on a stretcher down to the cold, basement area where they were put in a freezer. And I had to do all that at the age of 22, and that got me really deeply thinking about life and death, and the meaning of life. And that's when I was doing my deep studying of things like the Gospels. It's the first time I'd ever read the Gospels in full. I'd already done part of a philosophy degree, but never actually studied them. So my real degree was here in Canada, and I really respected the American Indian culture when I looked into it. So then I decided to come back to Britain to stop World War III, quote unquote. I'm not doing very well. Well, touch wood, it's... And then I went back to America a few times in the 90s to give talks. I went to the UN headquarters a couple of times, and I went to an amazing academic centre in Oklahoma, and I learned about the American Indian culture there. because that was Indian territory. When the American Indians were pushed out of the East Coast area, they were all shipped off. And the most famous or infamous was the Cherokee tribes were force marched on the Trail of Tears to what was called Indian territory. And then it was turned into the state of Oklahoma. And a lot of the people I met there who, were my teachers and I taught there as well, so they were my students, were descended partly from the Cherokees and other Indian tribes. And I went to the university in Oklahoma and I studied, there was a Center for American Indian Studies. I did my first peace pipe ceremony there. I learned what tobacco is all about and how you use it, which is as a prayer tool. It's a ceremonial way of having a communal prayer. And I learned the legend of where tobacco came from, the white buffalo calf woman. And it was amazing. I felt I'd come home. I learned about Deganawida, the greatest North American Indian shaman elder, who was from the Great Lakes region and who brought a kind of spiritual teachings from Great Spirit to bring peace to the tribes. He instituted the first ever sort of federal sharing of power among the tribes. They would have a council of elders from all the tribes would send representatives. And if any disputes arose, they would be dealt with by them.
The Council of the Elders.
The Council of the Elders, yeah. This was Deganawida's gift from Spirit to his people. And it's still going, the structures he put in place in that region in New York State. And that influenced the founders of the US when they were trying to think of what kind of constitution we can have in the US. When they broke away from Britain, they people like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin went and talked to the Indians and said, well, how do you do it? And they learned Deganawida's ideas. And that became one of the sources for the Constitution, which, so I learned all that when I was there, and I was very, very moved. I think the voice of the American Indian wisdom elders is very important, should be on the agenda for religious studies departments, not just learning about the main religions, but the American Indian voice. That's why it's here in the table as box number 8, as one of the primal religions. And obviously tobacco has gone around the world. People like tobacco, but very few people know how to use it and what it's actually for. They were also using shamanic psychedelic things like ayahuasca down in the south and in Mexico and New Mexico, and still are. It's protected. I mean, if you're an American Indian, you can access these things legally. And they were going on their vision quests. And people now are realizing there's a lot of wisdom in all this. The women were very powerful. They were equally as powerful as the men. Some tribes, the women were the elders who made the real decisions, the matriarchs of the tribe. So this is all very important stuff, I think, in my opinion. I also, I've written a few papers on American Indian religious history, which have been published in encyclopedias and things as an academic. And so there's a lot there to learn from. And fast forward, what upsets me about Trump and Trumpism is they're completely ignorant of and abusive to the native American Indian culture. They treat the native culture as something just not even worth bothering with. And what they've done is they've disenfranchised the voters, because they brought in, they need special kinds of bits of paper to be able to vote. But most American Indian tribes on reservations don't have access to that stuff. They don't have passports. They don't have things. So they've disenfranchised a lot of the Native American voters. And their policies, closing down the kinds of social infrastructure that make life bearable, are going to devastate the Native peoples. And I think that, I think it's shocking. So the sooner the good people of America stand up and are proud of their heritage. And the other great American Indian leader I learned about is called Sequoyah, who was a Cherokee. And he knew all about the Trail of Tears. He ended up in Oklahoma, and he devised an alphabet in which you could write down the Cherokee language. And they became very literate. The Bible was translated into Cherokee. They had newspapers. We're talking the 1830s, 1840s. And he said, there's nothing wrong with Christianity. The people are not adhering to it because I've actually read their scriptures. And he complained in the name of Great Spirit about the misuse of so-called Christianity to demonize native people. No, native people have as much access to God as any vicar or priest or so-called Christian, said Sequoyah. And I 100% agree.
I should assume so.
I went to the cabin where he lived in Oklahoma, which is now a sort of protected thing. It's in a memorial park. One can visit it, and so he was an educator, and his argument was that the native people's heritage is so important they should study it, learn it, be proud of it, and then have an interfaith sort of conversation with these white men flooding into their country and try and get a peace agreement. And that's still, that work is still to be done. And Sequoyah gave his name to the tallest tree, I think, on the planet, which is quite appropriate, the Sequoia pine, giant redwood. So there we are, that's the American Indian ones. Any comments? You've been all around America, haven't you?
I've been around a few other countries, mostly. Well, I've been to Texas, Louisiana,
Right.
Georgia, California, of course,
Okay.
and
How did you get about? On bikes or
by ship.
by ship? So
By
this
ship.
is when you're in the
In the
Marine.
Merchant Marine, yeah.
Okay.
Rented cars when we had a few days in for example, Houston area, Texas City, Houston area.
Yeah.
Rented car and moved around a bit, and also a bit when I later in business I've been in Texas a few times, or in US a few
Okay.
times. I have family in Illinois, family in Texas.
Okay. Norwegian family.
Yeah.
Ah. Well, they did discover North America. Actually, I think they were the first. The Vikings, weren't
Apparently.
they? From the European continent.
I think they arrived in Newfoundland
Yeah.
or Nova Scotia region.
Mm.
They called it Vinland. We all thought when we read about it as kids that that was the land of wine and stuff, but it was Vin is old Viking language for flat. So they were in a flat region of the world, of the states.
Interesting, and that's kind of how Denmark ended up with Greenland, as it's, and that of course is something the Trumpists don't like. So it's a funny old world, isn't it?
What if Putin wants Alaska back?
Putin, the enigma of the Kremlin. Mm. Well, I wish he would.
It will be as natural as Trump wants Greenland, wouldn't it?
I just hope that Putin is forwarded my letter from the ambassadors in Dublin. I wrote to the Ukrainian and Russian ambassadors with a bunch of other signatories, saying, please extend your peace truce beyond 3 days to a whole year. And he did a truce for Easter, then he did another truce for May Day, which is
May
like
9th, 3 days for, wasn't it? 3
yeah.
days.
So I mean that's probably about to end. I just hope I don't wake up tomorrow and hear that they've started firing missiles again at Ukraine. Wouldn't it be lovely if they say
it's the freed or the what's it, Victory Day? That's 9th of May, so it's probably 8th, 9th, 7th, 7th, 8th, 9th, or 8th, 9th, 10th. It's just words, isn't it?
Well, I just would like it to last for a whole year. Obviously, that's my prayer.
I would like it to be permanent,
Yeah.
but I would like
Yeah.
also I would also like the Ukrainians to have their own country back.
Ha! Yes. Well, that is a good way to move on to our second one, which is Political Theory and Practice, box 165. And so, yes, talking about Lowenstein earlier, and as a political theorist, he wanted to set up the first department of political theory in Germany. There wasn't one. You did political theory in sort of law departments, a bit in philosophy departments. It took a long time to get political science recognised as a field in its own right. When I did my degree at the University of London, I did a whole course on the history of political ideas, which was fascinating, starting right back in ancient Greece, listening to lectures by some of the world's leading experts on classical origins of political thought, going back to Plato. A lot of his writings are about politics. And Plato, of course, an Athenian aristocrat, student, disciple of Socrates, who'd been killed by the Athenian radical democrats for being a heretic. I mean, just, absurd charges. And then Plato went off and studied independently, travelled around, went to Egypt, and took notes. And he went to southern Italy to discover the Pythagorean tradition, because Pythagoras had also dabbled a bit in politics. What they were trying to do was to get people to be virtuous. What Plato was saying is the state will only be as virtuous as the mass of people in power or who are standing for election and so on. If you corrupt the morals of a state, in those days they were small city-states like Sparta or Athens, then they will elect vicious people. So he thought this brilliant idea was, well, how about if we educate people into virtue? And that was Pythagoras' idea. He set up the first academy in Croton, in the south of Italy, as an academic centre for intellectual and moral excellence. And his idea was, if you could educate people, so they were doing the equivalent of degrees, let's say, and then they would become leading people in their respective cities and steer the people into the right paths. And Plato had the same idea. That's why he set up the academy in Athens. The problem is, what do you do when you get really vicious and power-crazy people who don't want to listen to moral lectures or philosophy? And he himself had that problem because Plato himself dabbled in politics a bit in Syracuse, which was a great city-state in Sicily, part of the Greek diaspora, and it was run by a chap called Dionysus, who was basically a tyrant, and who wasn't going to accept Plato's ideas. And he went there 3 times, and he stuck him in prison a couple of times, and was going to sell him as a slave. So so that was Plato's attempts. Didn't really work very well. So he went back to Athens and did more theory, and wrote the Laws. That was his last book, about what would a just state be like in terms of legislation and law. It's fascinating stuff. And then, anyway, he died eventually in his 80s after contributing all this stuff. And then his greatest pupil, Aristotle, carried on with the flag. And it was Aristotle that then took Plato's ideas, which were sketched in sort of dialogue form, like almost like poetry, theatre, and turned it into science. So Aristotle had a much more organised kind of mind, much more scientific mind, and he really invented political science in his treatises. And he defined the types of states. He got everyone that was going around the Greek Mediterranean to report back on what their city-states were like. And he came up with a threefold definition of states. One is an aristocracy, where ideally the best educated people rule the thing. The other is a monarchy, where one guy's in charge. And the other is a democracy, where the majority get to vote and they make the decisions. And Aristotle tabulated, he studied all the different city-states around the Mediterranean, cataloguing them and dividing them into the different kinds. And then he went a step further. He said, okay, so that's the ideal form. An ideal monarchy is great. If it's a virtuous ruler, a just, intelligent monarch, it can be great. But if it degenerates, it becomes a tyranny. So the ideal form of monarchy becomes a tyrant ruling, who can be vicious, he can arrest people. Because he's got total power, he can do what he wants, he can torture people. A aristocracy sounds great in theory, but if it degenerates, it becomes a plutocracy, because the wealthy people dominate, and they create a sort of cabal of elite wealthy people that control everything. So that's what happens when an aristocracy degenerates. And then a democracy sounds great, but what about when it degenerates? It becomes then a sort of mob rule, like in the French Revolution, with armed gangs roaming around the streets, arresting aristocrats and killing them off. Or as happened in Nazi Germany, when the mob took over the streets in the name of democracy. No, our Führer's the best, we elected him, let's go and kill everyone who doesn't agree. So Aristotle realised that political science has to firstly do the typology of these things and then work out how they degenerate. There seems to be a kind of moral entropy in human beings where we degenerate to our worst character. And what's the antidote to that? You know, so that's the beginning of political science, really. Can you see any shades that Aristotle might shed some light on what's going on in the States? We talked about this.
I think he would struggle.
I mean,
But democracy is failing seriously in the States, as far as I can understand.
it seems to have been turned into a plutocracy, which is exactly what Aristotle said when it goes wrong. The rich, the elites take over, and they do what they want, and that's what's happened. So, you know, what Aristotle didn't say, the lost volume that we don't have, is what do you do when a democracy turns into a plutocracy? I mean, that's...
Darn Aristotle.
You know...
He should have finished the job.
Well, yes, bring him back. I'm sure other political scientists, you know, struggle with this one. But I'll do some research on that, because it's an important question that needs answering.
It needs answering, and when the way I see it, the problem, the issue is that the elections, most of the elections are for 4 years, and once you have elected a person or a plutocracy,
they can do what they want.
They can do what they want for 4 years.
They
At
think
least,
they can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
There should have been a somehow an emergency break.
Yeah.
They should have had a
Yeah, if somebody's acting totally outside the Constitution, they should be exposed and sacked. I mean, that's one of my...
That's why you have the high courts or the
Except that the president appoints the Supreme Court people, and so
that's all right, all
he
wrong.
can control that.
That's all wrong.
Well, yes, of course it is.
They should all be totally impolitical.
Of course, they should just stick to the law, but it seems that in Trump world, the law has no value, and I mean, it's incredible that Trump sent in FBI people to arrest a judge in her courtroom because they didn't like her findings. I mean, that is a gross interference of the separation of powers. I mean, the president has no right to interfere in the courts.
They did
He's
have
sending
to
in people
release
to
her,
arrest.
of course,
They did release her.
yeah.
Well, they should never have done it in the first place. It was a warning. It was like a terrorist action.
It was.
And the thinking that they've got the right to do that is what is so appalling. So we're in a very strange place in American politics. We're not there in Europe, and we won't be. There's still a respect for democracy and constitutionalism and the rule of law. And then there's Israel. Like, what's going on in Israel? Because it's supposed to be a democracy, and they always say, we're the most democratic state in the Middle East, you know, you should be on our side.
Well, I don't know whether you read the news there today. The all flights in and out of Ben Gurion Airport have been held back because the Houthis actually managed to get in a missile strike close to the airport.
Well, that's another few thousand Houthis going to be killed then, isn't it? Because, you know, it's a bit of a one-sided battle. The Houthis are up against Israel plus the USA.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't I don't think there'd be much contest really. So it shouldn't be this. My concern about what's going on in the politics of Israel again is a particular faction, and it goes back to Carl Lewinstein's point, because when the Likud movement of what I call political Zionism, it's they're masquerading as Democrats. What they've done is, because you see, in the territory that they control, it includes Palestine, it included Gaza. They have a duty of care to those people.
They should have.
They're also citizens of that, you know,
Region.
that territory.
Yeah.
And in international law, the government of Israel has a duty of care to the people in Gaza and in the West Bank of Palestine. They've completely torn that up, tearing up all respect for international law. So I'm concerned about this.
But they are entitled to do that because of Holocaust. You see that, and
Yeah, that doesn't work in logic. It doesn't.
It
work
doesn't
in
work anywhere
logic.
else than in Knesset, I think.
I mean,
and
you know, the Holocaust was a tragedy and
of course it was.
a catastrophe, and all decent people agree with that. But it doesn't then give you the right, as a state or as a person, to then go on and do acts of genocide against other people. That's an inversion of authentic moral thinking.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody comes and murders my children, let's say I've got 3 daughters, so they kill one of them, right? Well, I don't have the right to go and then kill their entire village and 10,000 children of theirs in revenge. I mean, that's not moral. I mean, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So, you know, I should be able to kill one and get away with it, according to biblical
theory,
law.
yeah.
But so I'm very disturbed about what's going on, and there's a very important film on Double Down News, fronted by a Palestinian American intellectual, a lawyer, who lives in Paris actually, and it's exposing the what's really going on in Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine, and how the mainstream media are totally ignoring it. I don't think, you see, in the Liberal Democrat universe, we believe in the freedom of the media, but then also the responsibility of the media to tell truth. And what we're very suspicious of is when plutocratic forces control all the media and then won't allow rival narratives to be told. That's when democracy dies a death. And when plutocrats can buy up the media, the social media as well, anything becomes possible, because you can. There was very shocking footage of this, of a debate in the Knesset actually, which I have been to. I know the Knesset in Israel, and